of the EU can play a constructive part in future plans, so it's very helpful. Thank you. And last but by no means least, I will pass the floor to Mr. Bruno Lété, who is Senior Fellow at the German Marshall Fund of the United States. Please.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and it's a real pleasure to be back at this committee and to join you for this first session of the year, I understand, especially to talk about such an important theme. I would like to perhaps also start a little bit with history, just like William did, but I think it's useful to do that, to remind us the value of the INF. The INF Treaty ended the so-called European missile crisis between Moscow and Washington that lasted roughly from 1978 to 1985. I think the crisis, this European missile crisis, escalated to such levels that when the INF Treaty was signed in 1987, nearly 3,000 US and Soviet medium-range missiles had been deployed, all of them aiming at the European continent. I want to start a little bit with history because it is a stark reminder of what is at stake here. And why the fact that the United States and Russia no longer see eye to eye on arms control, at least in terms of the INF, signifies a real critical security concern for us in Europe. If the INF ends, and if the US and Russia were once again to deploy these types of weapons, it will be Europe that is in the line of fire. So I think for us Europeans, the strategic consideration is very straightforward. Either we get rid of the weapons, or we have them being pointed at us. Therefore, I think there can be only one natural policy choice for Europe, and that is to push the Americans and the Russians to engage in arms control and even disarmaments. Now, can the INF Treaty be saved? I think I need to join my colleague here in being a little bit skeptical. I'm not that enthusiastic about next week's outcome. It seems to me, despite a very noble effort of the German foreign minister last week to be in Moscow and to talk to the Russian counterpart, it seems to me that Europe is trying to save a treaty that no one really wants to save. And why? Let's put some facts in a row here. Let's look at the Russian party. First, there's really no strategic value to Russian interests to safeguard the INF. The Russians, for nearly a decade now, have been spending considerable amount of money to develop enhanced cruise missile systems. They actually have already deployed 2 SSC-8 missile units, namely close to Yekaterinburg in the Ural, and another unit at the Kapustin Jar test site in the Caspian. The use of medium-range missiles, I think William clearly elaborated on that, is fully integrated in Russian military tactics, the so-called active measures that combine conventional, hybrid and nuclear force to destabilize an opponent. Guess who's the opponent here? But also I think that Russian leaders fear the expansion of the United States missile defense in Europe and also in Asia. It could undermine Russia's nuclear second strike capability in the long term, and thus make Russia susceptible to intimidation. So cruise missiles for Russia are therefore a cheap, reliable and quick capability to eliminate US missile defense positions. In sum, INF goes against Russian calculus. Secondly, let's look at the United States. So the United States has been complying with the INF, there's no doubt about that, but the treaty may increasingly become peripheral to American interests too. The Trump administration has clearly been reversing Obama's efforts to zero down on nukes. That era is over. And there are multiple examples. Take, for instance, the decision of the US administration in February 2018 to rearm US submarine missile launchers with nuclear warheads. That move was principally justified to defend the allies in Asia. There's also controversy here in Europe regarding the US deployment of Mk-41 launchers in Romania. and soon also in Poland. Now, those launchers are pure for defensive purposes. That is clear. However, these systems could also easily be used against targets in Russia, an option that is explicitly mentioned in the US nuclear posture review from February 2018. It is also clear that a new INF arms race will threaten the security of Europe, the security of Asia, but not that of the American continent. So the cost for the US to abandon INF is limited in this regard. Thirdly, we talked already a bit about China as well, but I would like to say a few things there as well. Russia and the United States want to free themselves from the treaty's shackles because they feel that the new nuclear powers with INF capabilities have emerged in South and East Asia. Not in the least, China's INF arsenal has grown substantially, and that arsenal is really aimed at deterring Russia and the United States from regional intervention in South and East Asia. It is a serious problem that China is not a contracting party for the INF. It means indeed that China can develop and deploy medium-range rockets at will. And it is that dynamic that is perceived both in Washington and in Moscow as a strategic disadvantage. Now, President Trump has repeatedly put the decision to withdraw from the INF in the context of a global political struggle between the United States, Russia, and China, and said that China, perhaps, could be part of a new INF arrangement. Now, I'm a little bit skeptical on that one. Actually, already in 2007, there was an attempt, a joint Russian-US attempt to multilateralize the INF treaty at the United Nations. That failed. The Chinese Foreign Ministry has also reacted strongly against Trump's recent public statements. If you look at the Chinese arsenal, if China would join the INF, approximately 90% of China's estimated 1,600 medium-range cruise missiles would have to be dismantled, would have to be destroyed, because these are in the INF range. So with a trilateral INF, as we would call it, China would lose almost all of its capacity for regional power projection. It would not be able to maintain its strategy to sealing off the East and South China sees from US interventions. So it's therefore unlikely that China would cut such a deal with the Russians and with the Americans. So perhaps to end here slowly, moving forward, post-mortem INF treaty, what are the scenarios for Europe? Well, I think there's three scenarios for Europe. So either we are a united Europe opting for a deployment race with Russia, fueled by US missiles. Now, that would be a little bit of a return to the situation in 1979. Think also about the social unrest that this caused in Europe, the protests, the popular upheaval. The consequences here, especially in terms of military risk, would be significant for Europe. A second scenario would be that a united Europe rejects the deployment of missiles on the continent, all member states together, that we are seeking other solutions with our international partners. That, of course, would perhaps come at some cost for our transatlantic relationship that already faces some serious challenges, and it would in any case not prevent the Russians to do whatever they want and deploy the missile systems. There's a third scenario as well. Perhaps there will be a coalition of willing member states that will deploy cruise missiles on the continent. But that, of course, would come at a potential risk to split the NATO alliance. So none of these scenarios really seems to offer attractive options. But it's clear that we Europeans are standing at a crossroads, and we must choose. And our choice will probably have consequences for at least the next generation to come. So I would definitely look forward to encourage all of us, or at least encourage all of us to look at this matter very carefully, discuss, and hopefully we'll come to a good outcome. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, and equally, though slightly less optimistically, your assessment of the scenarios that we are facing. I have no doubt that many colleagues have a number of interesting questions. So I will take the first round of questions now and start with my colleague, Mr. Gahler.
Yeah, I'll speak in German. Attention, please. So, vielen Dank.
Thank you very much. Thank you for those presentations. I think the presentation of the facts and the figures are non-controversial. I also think it is very unfortunate that the prospects for the treaty are so negative, and I think within all our frameworks,